The low hum of engines echoed through the deserted streets of Iron Ridge. The town, nestled between towering mountains, had long been a peaceful refuge for those seeking quiet. But tonight, trouble had arrived. Logan Callahan adjusted his position in his wheelchair, his sharp eyes tracking the group of bikers rolling to a stop outside Helen's diner. His Belgian Malinois Shadow sat beside him, ears perked, body tense with unspoken anticipation. The leader of the pack dismounted first, tall, broad, with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. He was known as Reaper, the ruthless head of the Riders of Chaos. His men followed closely, heavy boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Inside the diner, the regulars fell silent. Helen, the owner, gripped the coffee pot a little tighter. Sheriff Owen, seated near the counter, straightened up, hand inching toward his holster. The door swung open with a creak. The Riders of Chaos stepped in, their leather cuts decorated with skulls and fire insignias. The air turned thick with tension. Logan took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. Reaper's gaze settled on him, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, what do we have here? Reaper drawled, his voice laced with mock amusement. A war hero, huh? Thought you'd be taller. A few of his men chuckled. Shadow's muscles coiled, sensing the hostility. Logan remained calm. He'd seen worse men in worse places. I hear you're the man to talk to around here, Reaper continued, stepping closer. See, my boys and I, we're looking to set up shop. Thought we'd offer the town a little protection. Logan exhaled slowly, placing his cup down. Protection from what? Reaper chuckled, tapping his fingers against the counter. Accidents happen in places like this. Fires, break-ins. Sometimes folks don't know what's good for them. Sheriff Owen's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. Iron Ridge doesn't need your kind of protection. Reaper's smirk widened. See, that's where you're wrong, Sheriff. He turned back to Logan. And I think our friend here knows it. Logan locked eyes with him, his voice steady. You've already made your first mistake. Reaper's amusement faltered for a split second. Yeah? And what's that? Logan's fingers grazed Shadow's head. The dog tensed, ready. You picked the wrong town. Reaper's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glint in his eye. The diner remained deathly silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. His fingers drummed against the counter, a slow, deliberate rhythm. That so? He muttered, eyes flicking to Shadow, who hadn't moved an inch but radiated a controlled, lethal energy. Logan didn't blink. You roll into town, assume we're weak, that no one will push back. You think a few leather jackets and loud engines make you the apex predator here. He let the words sink in, watching as Reaper's jaw clenched slightly. But you're in unfamiliar territory. And where I come from, men like you don't last long. The laughter from Reaper's men died down, replaced by a simmering edge of hostility. One of them, a stocky brute with a tattooed skull on his forearm, stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. You talk too much for a guy who can't stand up. Before Logan could respond, a low, guttural growl rumbled from Shadow's chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a promise, one that made Skull Tattoo hesitate. Shadow didn't lunge, didn't snarl, didn't bark. He simply waited, still as stone, his focus locked onto the threat in front of him. Reaper's smirk returned, but it was thinner now, forced. Cute trick, he mused, stepping back. But let's get one thing straight, Callahan. This town belongs to us now, You're just a reminder of what happens when men outlive their usefulness. He let the words linger, then turned on his heel. His men followed, though not before Skull Tattoo shot Logan a glare that promised future violence. The doors swung shut behind them, the sound of engines roaring to life cutting through the tense silence. Inside, Helen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sheriff Owen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Damn it, Logan, he muttered. You just painted a target on your back." Logan didn't take his eyes off the window, watching the taillights of the motorcycles disappear into the night. He reached down, scratching the scar above Shadow's eye. "They were always going to come for us," he said calmly. "Now they just know where to aim." Helen refilled his coffee, her hands still slightly unsteady. "What do we do?" Logan took a slow sip, letting the bitter warmth ground him. "We prepare." Shadow's ears twitched at the distant rumble of engines, his posture relaxed but ready. Logan glanced down at his companion, then back out at the road. Trouble had come to Iron Ridge, and it had no idea what it was in for. The night in Iron Ridge was colder than usual, the mountain air crisp and biting. Logan Callahan wheeled himself out of Helen's diner, Shadow moving in perfect sync beside him. The town was quiet now, but the echoes of the Riders of Chaos still lingered in the air. He had seen this pattern before in war zones, in cities overtaken by fear. First, intimidation. Then, control. If the town didn't resist now, it never would. Iron Ridge wasn't big, just a small forgotten dot on the map, tucked between mountain roads and dense forests. It had a single main street lined with local businesses: Helen's Diner, Joe's Hardware, a small grocery store, a barbershop, and a gas station run by Mike, a retired trucker with a mean right hook. The town had no major attractions, no booming economy, no strategic importance. And yet, that was exactly what made it valuable to men like Reaper. A quiet town meant no federal oversight, no big city police force, no one watching too closely. Logan had lived here for 3 years, choosing solitude over the noise of a world that no longer made sense to him. After Afghanistan, after the explosion that cost him his legs and the brothers he had fought beside, he needed the silence. He had spent months relearning how to navigate life without the ability to stand, adjusting to the weight of a body that no longer moved the way it once did. Shadow had been with him through it all, his last link to the past, his only real connection to the man he used to be. The Belgian Malinois wasn't just a pet. He was a soldier in his own right. They had served together in the worst parts of the world, running nighttime ops, clearing compounds, tracking high-value targets. Shadow had saved his life more times than Logan could count, and in return, Logan had done everything to make sure the dog never felt abandoned after service. They were a team, always had been. Sheriff Owen pulled up beside him in his old patrol car, rolling down the window. "They'll be back," he said, voice laced with frustration. "You know that, right?" Logan nodded, watching the empty street. "Yeah, I know." Owen sighed. "Town's not ready for this. We don't have the manpower, the firepower. Hell, half the people here still don't lock their doors at night. That needs to change." The sheriff rubbed a hand over his face. He was a good man, honest, stubborn, but smart enough to know when he was outmatched. He had spent 20 years in law enforcement, most of it in bigger cities before moving to Iron Ridge for a quieter life. He hadn't expected to face organized crime in a town of barely 2,000 people. "You think Reaper's just here to shake us down?" Logan asked. Owen shook his head. "No. This is bigger than extortion." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I heard from a contact over in Clearwater. Similar gang rolled in last year, started small, just like this. Within 6 months, half the businesses were under their control, and the ones that refused?" He let the sentence hang. "They weren't around much longer." Logan's grip tightened on his wheels. "And the cops?" Owen's jaw clenched. "Couldn't prove a damn thing. Witnesses were too scared to talk, and the ones who did." He shook his head. "Let's just say they didn't get a second chance." Logan exhaled slowly. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't about a few bikers looking for easy money. It was a calculated takeover. "They'll test us first," Logan murmured. "Push boundaries, see how much resistance they meet. If no one pushes back, they move in for real." Owen tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, then looked at him. "I've got one deputy, a shotgun, and a town full of people who've never had to fight for anything. What do we do?" Logan glanced at Shadow, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the streetlights. Then he looked back at Owen. "We make sure they realize they picked the wrong town." Owen exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn it, Logan. You do realize this isn't some battlefield in the Middle East, right? We don't have drones, we don't have backup. This is just a quiet town with regular folks who don't know the first thing about fighting." Logan's fingers tapped lightly against the wheel of his chair. "That's what Reaper is counting on." He tilted his head toward Shadow, who sat perfectly still, scanning the street with the same precision he had in Afghanistan. But war isn't about who has the biggest guns. It's about knowing your enemy, understanding their patterns. They're not expecting resistance. That's our advantage. Owen scoffed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Advantage? You're in a wheelchair, Logan. You really think you and that dog can stop them on your own?" Logan's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Not on our own. But we don't have to fight them head on. We just have to make this town more trouble than it's worth." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. What do you have in mind?" Logan's mind was already working through the logistics. "First, we get eyes on them. We need to know where they go, what they're after. They're setting up for something bigger, and we need to find out what before they make their move." Owen frowned. "You think this is about more than just extortion?" Logan nodded. "Clearwater, the other towns they've taken over, it's the same pattern. They establish control, push out anyone who resists, and then they start moving product." Owen's face darkened. "Drugs? Maybe, or weapons, stolen goods, whatever it is. They need a quiet place to operate. Iron Ridge is perfect. Remote, no federal presence, small police force. If we don't stop them now, we won't get another chance." The sheriff cursed under his breath, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. "All right. What's step 2? Logan glanced down the street. "We make sure the town knows what's coming. They need to be ready, not just for a fight, but for the long game. People need to start locking their doors, watching their neighbors' backs. We cut off their leverage before they can establish it." Owen sighed. "That's easier said than done. A lot of folks here still think nothing bad can happen in Iron Ridge." Logan's expression hardened. "Then we show them otherwise." The sheriff shook his head. "You've got that look again." Logan arched a brow. "What look?" "The one that got a lot of people killed back in your military days." Owen's voice was flat. "I know you, Logan. You're not gonna let this go." "No," Logan admitted. "I'm not." Owen exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right. You've got my badge and my gun. What else do you need?" Logan's smirk widened. "A few favors. And a lot of patience." They spent the next few days quietly spreading the word, warning business owners and longtime residents to stay alert. Logan worked through Helen, who had been in town longer than anyone and knew exactly whose ear to whisper into. Mike, the gas station owner, was the first to sign up for watch duty, followed by Joe from the hardware store. The town might have been quiet, but that didn't mean it was defenseless. Meanwhile, Logan and Shadow began tracking the riders of chaos, watching from a distance as the bikers scouted potential locations, empty warehouses, the abandoned rail station at the edge of town, anywhere with enough space to store whatever operation they were planning. Shadow's training came in handy, his keen senses picking up movement in the dark long before Logan could spot it. Then, on the 4th night, things escalated. A call came through Owen's radio just past midnight. "Sheriff, we've got a problem." It was Mike, his voice tight with fear. "They're here." Gas station. Owen and Logan exchanged a look before the sheriff slammed his foot on the gas, tires screeching against the pavement. Logan grabbed Shadow's harness, steadying himself. They're making their first real move. Owen's jaw clenched. Then let's make sure it's their first mistake. The sheriff's car screeched to a stop in front of Mike's gas station, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Logan was already scanning the scene before Owen had even shifted into park. The neon sign above the station flickered, half burnt out, casting a dim, sickly glow over the parking lot. 3 motorcycles were lined up near the pumps, their engines still idling. A 4th bike was tipped over near the entrance, a shattered glass bottle lying beside it. The station's front door was wide open, and inside, Logan could see movement shadows shifting between the shelves. "Stay here," Owen muttered, reaching for his gun. Logan scoffed. "Not a chance." He tightened his grip on Shadow's harness. "Let's move." Owen cursed under his breath, but didn't argue. They stepped out together, the sheriff's presence a clear warning. But Logan knew these men weren't the type to back down just because a badge showed up. Inside, Mike was backed up against the counter, his jaw clenched. Across from him stood Skull Tattoo, the same brute who had threatened Logan at the diner. He held a crowbar in one hand, lazily spinning it in his grip. Another biker was rifling through a display of motor oil, knocking bottles to the floor as if searching for something worth taking. "You've got about 10 seconds to explain what you're doing here," Owen said, his voice calm but firm. Skull Tattoo turned, grinning when he saw Logan. "Well, look who decided to roll in." "You following me, cripple?" Logan didn't react. He let Shadow do the talking. The Belgian Malinois stepped forward, muscles taut, ears forward, his amber eyes locked onto the man in front of him. The biker's grin faltered for just a second. "We're just making conversation," he continued, forcing nonchalance into his tone. "Mike here doesn't seem to understand how things work. We're just educating him." "Yeah?" Owen raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly were you teaching him with that crowbar?" The biker smirked but didn't answer. Mike's voice cut through the tension. "They want me to pay protection money." His fists were clenched, but his voice was steady. "Said bad things happen when people don't cooperate." Owen's hand rested on his holster. "Iron Ridge doesn't do that kind of business." The biker laughed. "Maybe not yet. But things change." Before Owen could respond, Logan wheeled himself forward, putting himself directly between Skull Tattoo and Mike. "You want to shake someone down?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Try me." The biker's smirk returned, but his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "Man, I don't know if you've noticed, but..." He moved fast, trying to snatch Logan by the collar. Shadow struck first. The Malinois lunged, snapping his jaws shut just inches from the biker's arm, his growl reverberating through the small store. The man yanked his hand back so fast he nearly tripped over himself. Owen pulled his gun. "That's enough." The biker raised his hands, but his smirk never fully disappeared. "Relax, Sheriff. We were just leaving." He took a slow step back, nodding toward his friend, who had gone stiff at the sight of the gun. "Come on." They turned, retreating out the door. But as Skull Tattoo reached the threshold, he hesitated, looking back at Logan. His smirk twisted into something uglier. "You don't know what you just started, Callahan." Logan met his gaze without flinching. "Neither do you." The bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, revving their engines before tearing off into the night. Owen exhaled sharply, lowering his gun. That could have gone worse. Logan glanced at Mike, who was still gripping the counter. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But it's only just begun." By morning, the whole town knew what had happened at the gas station. Logan wasn't surprised. Iron Ridge was the kind of place where news spread faster than wildfire. By noon, business owners were locking their doors earlier. Parents were keeping their kids inside, and people were walking with their heads down. Fear had taken root. That was exactly what the Riders of Chaos wanted. Logan sat outside Helen's diner, watching the street with a calm intensity. Shadow lay beside him, ears twitching at every passing car. Owen had been right. This wasn't a battlefield. But Logan had learned long ago that war came in many forms. This was just a different kind of invasion. The rumble of engines broke the midday silence. Logan didn't move as 4 bikes rolled down Main Street, slower than necessary, a show of force. Reaper led the pack, his expression unreadable beneath his dark sunglasses. He barely glanced at Logan as they passed, but Logan knew better. This wasn't avoidance. It was a message. Helen stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "They've been circling the town all morning," she muttered. "Checking who's scared and who isn't." "They're assessing," Logan said simply. "Seeing who might be willing to cooperate." Helen's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what about the people who don't?" Logan exhaled. "They'll find out soon enough." The door to the diner swung open, and Catherine walked out, her veterinary bag slung over one shoulder. Shadow's tail thumped once in recognition, but his posture remained alert. Catherine crossed her arms, eyeing Logan. "I hear you're planning something." Logan gave her a sidelong glance. "You hear a lot of things. Mike told me what happened last night." Her tone was firm, but there was concern beneath it. "You're pushing them." Logan met her gaze evenly. "They were always going to push. I'm just making sure they don't think we're an easy target." Catherine sighed, rubbing a hand over her temple. "I get it, Logan, I do. But these aren't just some punks looking for trouble. They're organized. They're dangerous, so am I." The words hung in the air between them. Catherine stared at him for a long moment before shaking her head. "Just be careful." Logan didn't respond as she walked away. He didn't need to. Careful wasn't an option anymore. That night, the attack came. It started small. Mike's truck tires slashed, the hardware store's front window shattered. Then, just past midnight, the real damage began. The fire started at Joe's Hardware, flames licking hungrily at the wooden storefront. By the time Owen's cruiser skidded onto the scene, the blaze was already raging. Logan arrived seconds later, Shadow moving low beside him. Owen was shouting orders, trying to control the small crowd that had gathered. Helen was among them, her face pale in the flickering light. "They cut the phone lines," she said, voice tight. No one could call it in until the fire was already out of control. Logan's jaw clenched. That wasn't random vandalism. That was strategy. Reaper wasn't just making a statement, he was establishing dominance. And Logan had no intention of letting that happen. The fire raged for nearly an hour before the townspeople managed to contain it. By then, half of Joe's hardware was gone, reduced to smoldering rubble. Joe himself stood nearby, gripping his hat and shaking hands as he stared at the remains of his livelihood. The crowd around him murmured in uneasy tones, their fear thick in the night air. This wasn't just property damage. This was a message. Owen stood beside Logan, his expression dark. "This is how it starts," he muttered. "First, intimidation. Then, destruction. Next, people start disappearing." Logan watched the embers glow in the darkness. Shadow sat at his side, alert but still, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "They want people scared," Logan said flatly. "And it's working." He glanced around, noting the tense shoulders, the nervous whispers. The town was already breaking, and Reaper knew it. A sudden movement caught Logan's attention. Across the street, a lone figure stood just outside the shadows, watching. Logan recognized him instantly, Marcus, Reaper's right-hand man. Unlike the other bikers, Marcus didn't flaunt his presence with loud threats or reckless violence. He was quieter, more methodical. And right now, he was studying the town's reaction. Logan met his gaze, holding it. Marcus smirked, then slowly stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. Owen followed Logan's stare. "That was intentional," he muttered. "They wanted you to see him." Logan nodded. "They're making sure we know this isn't over." Helen joined them, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "So what do we do now?" Logan's fingers curled around the armrests of his wheelchair. His mind was already working through possibilities. "We make sure they regret starting this." The next morning, Logan put his plan into motion. He and Owen spent the day reinforcing weak points, installing security cameras, setting up emergency radios, and organizing a town watch. Helen rallied local business owners, ensuring they were armed with more than just words. Meanwhile, Logan focused on something else entirely: gathering intelligence. He and Shadow spent hours tracking the bikers, observing their movements, mapping out their patterns. By the end of the day, he knew exactly where they were hiding. An abandoned truck depot on the outskirts of town, just past the ridge. The perfect base of operations. Night fell, and Logan made his move. He didn't bring Owen or the others. This wasn't a police job. This was something else. He and Shadow moved like ghosts through the darkness, avoiding the direct roads, sticking to the forested outskirts. From the cover of the trees, Logan watched the depot. A dozen bikes were parked outside, their chrome reflecting the moonlight. Inside, the faint glow of cigarettes flickered in the darkness, and voices carried through the night. Logan caught snippets of conversation plans, shipments, deadlines. This wasn't just about Iron Ridge. This was bigger. Then he heard something that made his blood turn cold. A name. Phantom Syndicate. Logan's grip tightened on Shadow's harness. That changed everything. Phantom Syndicate wasn't just another gang. They were an international operation, specializing in drugs, weapons, and human trafficking. If Reaper was working with them, it meant Iron Ridge was about to become a major distribution point. Logan exhaled slowly, calculating his next move. He couldn't take them down alone, not yet. But he could make sure they knew they weren't as untouchable as they thought. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small handheld device. A signal jammer. One press of a button, and their entire communication network would go dark. No calls, no messages, no coordination. Just confusion. Logan activated the jammer. Then, as Shadow remained perfectly still beside him, he whispered 2 words. "Cause chaos." Shadow bolted into action. Within seconds, the depot erupted into confusion, shouting, scrambling, bikers reaching for radios that no longer worked. Logan watched from the shadows, his smirk barely visible in the darkness. Reaper thought he was the predator. He was about to find out what it felt like to be hunted. The depot descended into chaos. Bikers scrambled for their radios, shouting over one another as their communication system collapsed. Logan watched from the shadows, every move calculated. He had no intention of fighting them head-on, not yet. This was about disruption, about planting doubt. Shadow slunk through the darkness, weaving between crates and motorcycles, his training turning him into a ghost among the enemy. Reaper emerged from inside the depot, his voice cutting through the confusion. "What the hell is going on?" His sunglasses were gone, revealing sharp, calculating eyes. He scanned the perimeter, his instincts already telling him something was wrong. Marcus was at his side, brow furrowed. "It's a jammer," he muttered. "Someone's screwing with our signal." Reaper's jaw tightened. "Find out who." Logan smirked to himself. He didn't have long before they started searching the area. He gave Shadow a silent command, and the dog moved, slipping deeper into the depot. Logan wheeled himself back, disappearing into the tree line. He wasn't here for a full assault, just a taste of what was coming. Then, a gunshot cracked the night. Logan's head snapped toward the depot. That hadn't been part of the plan. The shouting grew louder, more frantic. Someone had fired inside the building. Logan reached for his binoculars, scanning the scene. He spotted a figure running, a man, not a biker, moving with desperation. One of the townspeople. Logan cursed under his breath. Someone must have followed him here, thinking they could sabotage the depot on their own. The idiot had just walked into a death trap. Another gunshot rang out. The man stumbled, clutching his side. Bikers surrounded him within seconds, dragging him toward Reaper. Logan recognized him, Tommy, a kid barely out of high school, working at the grocery store. He wasn't a fighter. He was just scared. Logan clenched his jaw. The smart move was to wait, to let them deal with their own chaos. But Logan wasn't built for that. He couldn't leave the kid to die. He exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on his wheels. "All right, Shadow," he whispered. "Change of plans." The dog tensed, awaiting the signal. Logan took one last look at the depot, then wheeled himself forward, out of the shadows. Straight into the lion's den. Logan moved fast, pushing his wheelchair with precise, practiced force. The terrain was rough, but he had trained for worse. Shadow slunk beside him, silent, waiting. They had seconds before the bikers realized someone was coming. Tommy was on his knees now, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his side. Reaper loomed over him, expression unreadable. "Who sent you?" he demanded. Tommy shook his head, panicked. "No one, A fist cut him off, knocking him to the dirt." The other bikers laughed, but Reaper wasn't amused. He glanced at Marcus. "Take care of this." That was Logan's cue. He raised his modified flare gun and fired. A bright red light shot into the sky, bursting overhead. Every biker's head snapped up. Logan used the moment of distraction, launching forward with all the strength in his arms. Shadow moved in tandem, a silent missile streaking toward the group. The first biker barely had time to react before Shadow was on him, jaws locking onto his wrist. He screamed, dropping his gun as he stumbled back. Logan reached Tommy, grabbing the kid's arm. "Can you run?" Tommy gasped, nodding. "Then do it. Now." The bikers recovered fast. Reaper's eyes narrowed as he registered what was happening. "Shoot him." Marcus raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Logan yanked a smoke grenade from his vest, pulling the pin with his teeth. He tossed it between them, and thick gray fog exploded outward, swallowing everything. "Shadow, move!" Logan shouted. The dog released his target and sprinted back to his handler as Logan wheeled himself toward the nearest cover. Bullets ripped through the smoke, but the bikers were firing blind. Shadow reached Logan just as the smoke began to clear. He counted 2 down, one clutching his wrist where Shadow had bitten him, another groaning from where he had slammed into a crate. But the rest were regrouping. And now they were pissed. Reaper stepped forward, brushing off his jacket like he had all the time in the world. His men fanned out, cutting off Logan's exits. "I'll give you one thing, Callahan," he said, voice calm. "You've got nerve." He nodded at Shadow. "And one hell of a dog." He pulled a knife from his belt, flipping it once. "But this ends now." Logan didn't answer. He was already calculating, looking for openings, for weaknesses. The depot was still a battlefield. He just needed to make it his. Logan's grip tightened on his wheels, every muscle in his arms coiled like a spring. Shadow stood beside him, hackles raised, ready to strike. The bikers moved in, slow and confident, believing they had already won. Reaper twirled the knife lazily, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really thought you could take us down, cripple?" His men chuckled, the sound low and predatory. Logan didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. He shifted his weight, adjusting his center of gravity. Every movement mattered. Every second counted. "You made a mistake," Logan said calmly. "You assumed I was fighting alone." A sharp whistle cut through the air, and all hell broke loose. From the ridge above, Floodlights snapped on, blinding the bikers in a sudden wash of white. Gunfire erupted as Owen and his deputies opened fire from their vantage point, picking their shots with precision. The bikers scattered, ducking behind crates and motorcycles as bullets ricocheted off metal. The element of surprise had worked. Logan launched forward, wheels spinning furiously as he maneuvered through the chaos. Shadow shot ahead, targeting Marcus, the second in command. The man barely had time to raise his weapon before the Malinois hit him full force, knocking him flat. Logan didn't stop. He angled toward the nearest biker, using his momentum to slam his chair into the man's knees. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a scream. The man went down hard. Reaper was already moving. He lunged at Logan, knife flashing in the harsh light. Logan twisted, barely avoiding the blade as it sliced through the air inches from his face. He countered with a hard strike to Reaper's wrist, knocking the knife loose. The biker snarled, throwing a punch that connected with Logan's jaw. Pain exploded through his skull, but he had taken worse. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Reaper's arm, using his upper body strength to yank him forward. Off balance, Reaper stumbled, giving Logan just enough time to grab his sidearm. He pressed the barrel against Reaper's chest. "Move and you're done." For the first time, hesitation flickered across Reaper's face. Around them, his men were falling. Owen's team had already taken out half of them. Marcus was unconscious. The rest were either wounded or retreating. The fight was over. Reaper exhaled through his nose, the smirk returning, but weaker now. "This ain't over, Callahan." Logan didn't lower his gun. "Yeah, it is." Owen appeared beside him, shotgun at the ready. "Put him in cuffs." Deputies swarmed in, securing the remaining bikers. Shadow returned to Logan's side, his body still tense but his job complete. The depot was theirs. Iron Ridge had won. Logan finally let out a breath. It was over. For now. The aftermath of the battle at the depot lingered over Iron Ridge like a storm cloud, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the scene in sharp contrast, illuminating the fallen bikers being dragged to their feet, wrists bound in cuffs. Reaper was among them, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a cold, calculating silence. He didn't struggle, didn't fight. He simply watched as his empire crumbled around him. Logan wheeled himself forward, stopping just short of where Reaper stood. "I told you," Logan said, his voice even. "You picked the wrong town." Reaper held his gaze, then let out a low chuckle. "You think this is done?" He muttered. "There are more of us. Bigger players. You stopped me, but you haven't stopped them." Logan didn't blink. "Then I'll stop them too." Owen stepped in, grabbing Reaper by the arm. "You'll have plenty of time to think about that in prison." He nodded toward the deputies. "Get him out of here." As Reaper was hauled away, Logan let out a slow breath. The fight had been won, but he knew Reaper wasn't lying. The Phantom Syndicate was still out there, and if they had plans for Iron Ridge, tonight's battle wouldn't be the end of it. But right now, the town needed to heal. The next few days were a blur of cleanup, repairs, and difficult conversations. Helen's Diner became an unofficial headquarters, where townspeople gathered to process what had happened. Business owners boarded up shattered windows, reinforced doors, and started to talk seriously about long-term security. Fear still lingered, but there was something else in the air now, something stronger. Defiance. Joe, the hardware store owner, shook Logan's hand firmly when he saw him. "Never thought I'd see the day someone stood up to those bastards," he said. "You gave us our town back." Logan didn't take the credit. "You did that yourselves," he said simply. "I just made sure you had a chance." Catherine patched up minor injuries, moving between people with quiet efficiency. When she reached Logan, she crossed her arms. "You're lucky you didn't end up in worse shape," she said. "You keep pulling stunts like that, and one day you won't be so lucky." Logan smirked. "You've been saying that for years." She sighed, shaking her head. "One of these days I'll be right." Shadow sat beside Logan, his tail flicking against the floor. He had taken a few scratches during the fight, but nothing serious. Catherine crouched down, running a hand over his fur. "And you," she said softly, "are a damn hero." Shadow licked her hand in response. The town wasn't the same as it had been before. It never would be. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. People were stronger now, more aware. They wouldn't be caught off guard again. And neither would Logan. A week passed, and Iron Ridge slowly found its rhythm again. The damage was being repaired, the town moving forward, but things weren't the same. There was a quiet awareness now, a readiness that hadn't been there before. People no longer assumed their town was untouchable. They had seen what could happen, and they had learned how to fight back. Logan sat outside Helen's diner, watching the street. Main Street had more security cameras now. Businesses reinforced their doors, and Sheriff Owen had brought in extra deputies on rotation. The riders of chaos were gone, but Logan knew better than to think the danger had passed completely. Reaper's words still echoed in his mind: bigger players, more of us. The Phantom Syndicate wasn't going to forget what had happened here. They would be back. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not next month. But eventually. Catherine joined him, handing him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. She sat across from him, following his gaze down the street. "You don't think this is over?" she said. It wasn't a question. Logan took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth ground him. "It's not." She exhaled slowly. "So what now?" Logan glanced at Shadow, who lay at his feet, ears flicking at every passing sound. "Now," he said, "we get ready." Over the next month, Logan worked with Owen to turn Iron Ridge into something more than just a town. They trained volunteers in self-defense, taught business owners how to spot signs of trouble before it started, and built a real communication network. If trouble came again, Iron Ridge wouldn't be caught off guard. Logan didn't plan to wait for the Phantom Syndicate to make their next move. He would be watching. One morning, a black SUV rolled into town, sleek and out of place among the dusty trucks and old sedans. It parked across from the diner, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He wasn't a biker, wasn't law enforcement. He was something else. He adjusted his tie, scanned the street, and then his gaze landed on Logan. He smiled. Not a friendly smile. A knowing one. Logan leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression neutral. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked forward. The man gave Logan a slight nod before stepping back into his SUV and driving away. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Logan exhaled slowly. The fight for Iron Ridge wasn't over. It had only just begun.